I am really grateful for Denver Communists organizing this conversation. It has been timely for a while now, certainly the past 10 months, and it is certainly especially timely this week as kind of the world anticipates yet another military exchange between Israel and Iran. We're going to do a lot of necessary characterizing and criticizing of the Iranian regime, but I do think, being in the heart of imperialism, we should say up front, one, the very real risk that this exchange brings of a regional conflagration, and that none of this would be happening if not for the role of the US in the region, which has not only completely made Israel's genocide of Palestinians possible, but is now essentially giving Israel the opportunity to act belligerently across the region. And we already see the US continuing its support as it deploys yet another nuclear-powered aircraft carrier to the region, as well as thousands of troops, fighter jets, and just about everything that we have come to expect from the US war machine in the Middle East, especially when its attack dog, Israel, is threatened. So in that regard, we do have to certainly put forward a politics of no war with Iran. We need to certainly, as participants of the movement for Palestine, and many of us in unions, but certainly in our workplaces, organize our class here at the heart of imperialism to oppose U.S. imperialism, demand an end to the U.S. aiding of Israel, aiding of the genocide, aiding of belligerent actions, and support the military defeat of U.S. imperialism and Israel. That is essential. I am realizing that I do not have my notes pulled up, so we're going to do that real quick as I pivot to the next point. And so this, and just I think everyone knows, but just because I forgot to say, this confrontation also comes specifically after Israel assassinated top commanders of Hezbollah and Hamas, as well as assassinating within Iranian territory. And so because of this, and because of just in general the way the escalations have been ratcheting up over 10 months, while I don't want to make any specific predictions of how things will play out, it is certainly possible, that this could be yet another uptick in escalations, which once again risks devastating regional war, which is just the worst possible scenario for our class siblings and really all oppressed classes and people of the Middle East. So that is the context in which we're having this conversation. But we're also having this conversation in a context in which we've seen a historic, powerful international movement in solidarity with the national liberation struggle in Palestine. And this movement has a lot of different politics to it, and there is, unfortunately, a significant sector that does defer to the theocratic bourgeois nationalist politics that are put forward by the Iranian regime, as well as the axis of resistance, which is central to Iran's program. So, I'm looking at my notes. And so, again, like I said, the movement has to put forward, has to support the military defeat of the U.S. and Israel. It has to demand no war with Iran. And at least at Left Voice, we do give military support to all resistance to the U.S. and Israel. Now, what we as socialists cannot afford to do is, in giving military support to the various figures and groups that are military combating or Israel and the United States, we cannot give political support. And by obscuring the class character and the political program that the Iranian regime and the axis of resistance uphold, we do, run the risk of giving political support to a program that, quite frankly, has nothing to do with anti-imperialism, nothing to do with the liberation of Palestine, and in fact actively stands in the way of national liberation, at least in the way that we as revolutionary socialists understand and fight for. So I'll elaborate on this a bit later, but I just want to say up front that I think we have to understand Iran and through it the axis of resistance. In this moment, its role is to reorganize the Middle East around a program of theocratic bourgeois nationalism under the guise of national liberation, but which ultimately maintains and imperialism, as Lenin defined it, an epoch of capitalism, and which ultimately reorganizes and restructures capitalist relations in the Middle East to be centered around Iran as a regional capitalist power, and in the context of increasing capitalist confrontation between the United States and an emerging bloc, rival capitalist bloc led by China. And so in this context, Iran's strengthening of itself as a regional capitalist alternative to US and Western imperialism serves the role of advancing the rise of Chinese capitalism in the region and internationally. Now, with all of that in mind and that definition, how exactly did we get to a point in which Iran is able to convince sectors of an anti-imperialist movement and, quite frankly, some sectors of the working class, in the Middle East and masses? How has it been able to present itself as an anti-imperialist and liberatory alternative? There is a deep history to that, which I cover in my article at leftvoice.org, titled "The Ayatollah Won't Free Palestine, but Workers of the Middle East Can." There are points that I've decided not to cover in this meeting tonight because we only have so much time, and my throat will only, will get dry at a certain point if I talk about the whole history of Middle East. But in a sentence, I will just say that an important point that I cover in my article is that there's essentially two long traditions that came out of the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire, which represented the aspirations of workers and the masses of the Middle East to be free of colonialism and imperialism. This was communism, which did have a tradition and history in the Middle East. And there were communist movements, which were unfortunately degraded and betrayed by the rise of Stalinism in a counter-revolution, which took control of the Soviet Union and the Comintern, and abandoned internationalism and a politics of class struggle. So that's one thing. And then along with this is the rise of bourgeois nationalism in the form of the Pan-Arab movement, which essentially presented the idea that in order for the people of the Middle East to be liberated, they could develop their own national capitalist projects independent of imperialism and independent of the Soviet Union. And what this essentially did, the rise of this movement, is it failed to prepare and actually acted as a co-opting force on the potential for class struggle and workers playing a leading role in the region. And that led to ultimately a round of brutal imperialist interventions, such as the US coup of popular Iranian, I am so sorry, I'm truly blanking on if he was president or prime minister, but popular elected Mohammad Mossadegh. And I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. Again, I apologize. But that was a really horrible coup which implemented the brutal Shah regime, and we will get back to the brutal Shah regime, and also with the rise of Israel, other popular and leading figures representing the Pan-Arab movement, such as Egyptian President Nasser, were also defeated, humiliated. And so, again, I go into much more in depth in my article, but I think we need to understand that it was the betrayal of Stalinism, which discredited, or in the eyes of many, communism as a liberatory ideology, and the failure of Pan-Arabism and its limits because of its bourgeois character, that allowed for imperialist entrenchment in the region, as well as the strengthening of Israel as an outpost of US imperialism. However, there was another, actually, I'm going to take some water before I get into this because I just said a lot. However, even after these defeats, there was another upsurge in class struggle, super important upsurge in class struggle in the Middle East, which was the Iranian Revolution. As we discussed, the Shah, horrible, brutal, and put forward in a coup, and served as essentially another proxy of US imperialism. And through this role, Iran, under the Shah, was able to develop really advanced repressive apparatus and military apparatus, which we'll get into this more, but which the current Iranian regime inherited, as well as was able to advance the country's oil production and make it one of the most advanced economies in the region. However, he was not democratically elected. He was horrible, tortured, and just suppressed, and was awful to dissidents, to workers. And by the time of the revolution, everyone hated him. Now, we're told by both the bourgeois press as well as the Iranian regime that the Iranian Revolution was an Islamic revolution, that it was in character, led by essentially the theocratic politics that we see now. But this wasn't actually really the case. The Iranian Revolution brought together all different sectors of Iranian society, all united in their hatred of the Shah, but with various programs and strategies. And the left wing of this revolution, and quite frankly, the actual force that led it to victory, was the working class, as well as communist currents, which were unfortunately at this point very influenced by Stalinism, given the betrayal, but which still were to the left of the right wing of the revolution. And going back to the role of the Iranian workers, there is a really powerful history here in which, during the revolution, the workers themselves developed shuras, which were essentially workers' councils similar to the Soviets, which were this fundamental thing that led the Russian Revolution to victory, marking the first, and we would argue only, successful seizure of power by the working class and development of socialism. So the fact that this emerged within the Iranian Revolution too, this self-organization of workers in which they were taking up the revolution, is a really important history that we have to reclaim, and we cannot allow it to be buried. And another important point is that the final blow, which actually forced the Shah to flee the country, defeating him once and for all, came when the Iranian oil workers, a strategic sector, organized a general strike, which forced him to leave, and which was the final blow which ousted him. Now, unfortunately, another popular wing of the revolution was the right-wing Shia movement, represented by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And again, I apologize if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Incorrectly, fuck the guy, but we should still pronounce languages correctly. I just don't know how to. But yes, so this was the right wing of the movement, and not only was it right wing because of the deeply theocratic politics, representing a very right wing interpretation of Islam, but it also represented a different class element. This movement came out of the traditional middle class and petty bourgeois sectors of Iranian society that had seen their own class aspirations attacked by the Shah in service of US imperialism and capitalism along those lines. And so this movement was bourgeois in character and represented a bourgeois program for where the country should go. And because it did have at least some popular base of support, it was able to develop some level of influence in the revolution. But once the revolution had succeeded due to the workers and the influence of the left, what this right wing does is it wages a counter revolution in which it massacres. It's able to take power, and it massacres dissidents. It massacres the workers who had been central to the success of the revolution, massacres the leftist currents. And it's important to note that right after the revolution, Iran is invaded by Iraq, and this leads to the Iran-Iraq War, which the U.S., fearing the power of the Shoras, fearing the power of Iranian workers organizing themselves and leading the revolution and potentially developing society along their own class aspirations. Fearing all this, the United States essentially helps prop up the Ayatollah's regime, prop up the right wing of the revolution, and also arms both sides of the Iran-Iraq War to further fuel this. Meanwhile, the new Islamic regime essentially is able to further crack down on any dissent and purge its left-wing opposition under the guise of wartime unity. The result of this is that you get a revolution which did successfully oust a puppet of U.S. imperialism who terrorized workers of Iran and acted as an attack dog for U.S. imperialism in the region. So the fact that he was ousted is naturally incredibly inspiring to people of the Middle East who are sick of imperialism. But because it was the right wing which wages a successful counter-revolution and then is able to essentially take credit for the success of the revolution, the national liberation, this right wing is able to legitimize itself, and it moves forward with a program which ultimately maintains capitalism. Now, it does this in a few ways. First of all, it uses this really incredibly right-wing religious program, theocratic program, to gloss over class distinctions, to create essentially a new identity of what it means to be Iranian based on Islamic law, and use that to create a national consensus, which blurs the fact that there is still exploitation of workers in a capitalist Iran under this new regime, and also goes further, and in order to divide the working class, imposes extreme repression of women, of queer people, of religious minorities, and the like. And so this is the model that we see Iran develop, right? Again, so based on theocratic bourgeois nationalism, based on a logic of capitalism, but important to this is that it does have an air of national liberation. And it is true that it played a role in ousting US imperialism. Now, all of this may sound familiar because, along with being essentially the program of, quote, national liberation that Iran claims to represent today, we have seen other leaderships and movements emerge in the Middle East throughout the past decades as a result of both the longstanding U.S. imperialist interventions, including from the Iraq War to the and the War on Terror in general, as well as a hatred of Zionism as essentially, and the Zionist state as a proxy of U.S. imperialism and oppressor of the Palestinian people. So I'm not going to go into all the specific details of every group that emerges, but we see similarities play out in the rise of Hezbollah in Lebanon, in the rise of Ansar Allah in or the Houthi rebels in Yemen, quite frankly, in Hamas in Gaza. All of these come out and are able to establish themselves off of a real violence of U.S. imperialism and Zionism and the hatred people have of that, but with a program which essentially aspires towards what Iran has, which is a form of capitalist relations, which ultimately does not undo the economic exploitation that the working class experiences under capitalism, under an imperialist system, and in fact opposes the further development of class struggle, which could lead to the working class of the region actually taking control of its own fate against its national bourgeois governments, against U.S. imperialism, against Zionism, and all forms of oppression. And Iran sees this, and I don't think it's accurate to necessarily say every single group in the axis of resistance is an Iranian proxy. But Iran now exists as a military power in the Middle East, again, inherited a massive repressive apparatus from the Shah regime and is able to use that to establish an outsized military influence in the region. I think we could say that Iran, second to Israel, is the most powerful single force in the region. And it uses this as a way to make various groups essentially aligned with it and dependent on it. So materially, it's able to use the axis of resistance to bring different groups and leaderships closer to it through material support. But also, while there may be this or that form of ideological disagreement, all of the groups that make up this axis of resistance essentially are aligned with Iran on an ideological level because they have a bourgeois program. The aspiration of national liberation ends at a form of capitalism based on theocracy, based on division of the working class through extreme interpretation of Islamic law, and based on an imposition of these forms of relation from a repressive state, again, not allowing for what we saw in the Iranian Revolution, when workers themselves started developing their own way of running things and started thinking about how to organize their workplaces, how to fight for serious national liberation, right, in the form of shuras, and in the form of the greatest weapon that the working class has, which is strikes. And we've seen that ultimately, when class struggle develops, how this program plays out, right? Or we saw this in the Arab Spring And the Arab Spring was super important because after decades of division imposed by imperialism, as well as national bourgeois governments, which separate the workers of the Middle East along ethnic, yeesh, can't say that word today, lines, national lines, religious lines, sectarian divisions, right, and borders. The Arab Spring cut across that, uniting workers and the oppressed masses of the Middle East along their class lines and their aspirations to be free of exploitation and the misery of the imperialist system, the austerity, the humiliation, the oppression, the violence. So what role did Iran play? And quite frankly, what role did Hezbollah play? Iran, largely through Hezbollah, intervened in the uprising in Syria to aid the Assad regime in a crackdown of the protests against his horrible, brutal anti-worker regime. And what did we see again when just about 2 years ago, workers inspired by a feminist movement in Iran began rising up against the regime following the brutal murder of Gina Mahsa Amini. It's worth noting this was not there were limits to the role of workers there, but there was certainly interventions from the Iranian working class, and overall it was a popular uprising against the capitalist regime. Iran, as we know, cracked down, massacred student protesters, poisoned them, and maintained this repression. And I don't think it's a detail that many of the sectors of the Palestine movement that are most vocal in pointing to theocratic bourgeois nationalism as the model for national liberation are the same thinkers and groups and whatnot that called the Iranian uprising essentially a counter-revolution in service of U.S. imperialism, much like they did for the protest against Assad during the Arab Spring. And I think the desire to treat any uprising or any challenge to an ostensibly anti-U.S. capitalist, quite frankly, extremely right-wing regime, the desire to paint that as a threat speaks to a politics which ultimately believes that in order to achieve national liberation, first you need to do a bourgeois project independent of the U.S., and maybe we can talk about class struggle and the role of workers and the leadership of workers later, maybe. And this is, quite frankly, a logical outgrowth of Stalin's politics. That's maybe a conversation for another day. Or, again, read my article at leftvoice.org. The Ayatollah won't free Palestine, but workers of the Middle East can. Now, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I only have a few things left to say. I think, and as I talked a lot about that, but I think one more thing I want to add is, again, it's no secret that Iran's role in the region right now in this moment, and through using the axis of resistance, the legitimacy it's able to cultivate for itself through its alliance with those groups, as well as through the sectors of the Palestine movement that see Iran and these groups as liberatory forces. Through this, in this moment, Iran is able to strengthen its own influence, its political influence, as well as its military strength in the region, all in the service of furthering Chinese capitalism, and the emergence of Chinese capitalism and its reach in the Middle East. We've seen Iran recently. It's conducted military, high-profile, joint military actions with China as well as with Russia, the three of them together. China has played a central role in maintaining Iran and Iran's economy under international isolation and crushing sanctions. And we should be very clear, we oppose all the crushing sanctions. They are a war primarily against Iranians' working class. But it is also worth noting that in this context, China has also used this as a way to maintain its own influence and of Iran. And then China has also used Iran and in general the movement currently and the dynamics as a way to position itself as a diplomatic power. Recently, for example, organizing meetings between longtime Palestinian rivals Hamas and Fatah. And so, and I think as we've seen with the Arab Spring, as we've seen with the Iranian Revolution and with the feminist uprising, if a military defeat of the United States and Israel opens up space for class struggle in the Middle East, the consolidation of a rival capitalist bloc in the region offers nothing but more exploitation for workers of the Middle East, including Palestinians. And these regional ambitions that Iran has explains every single military action that it may take against Israel and the United States. Iran will pay lip service to the Palestinian cause because it's a convenient way for the regime, which is despised by its own people, to garner some legitimacy in the region and strengthen its influence. But every move it makes is very intentionally calculated towards not the goal of ending Israel's genocide, but towards maintaining the, sorry, I already said this, survival strength, and eventually to rise as the dominant capitalist power in the region. And in a context where we're seeing increasing trends towards confrontation between powers, Iran's rise and China's rise as new emerging capitalist powers can only come about through war and slaughter of the working class. Iran, through the axis of resistance and the groups that make it up, are lining the workers of the Middle East up for a war which does not bring liberation for them, which does not put forward a program in their interests, and which we cannot afford to support. With all of this in mind, I'm going to give a very controversial, but I think necessary take that I think we have to put forward as revolutionary socialists, which is that it is not enough for us to just criticize Iran. We cannot let the movement for Palestine, which has put a real internationalism of our class on the agenda, even from here in the heart of imperialism, we can't let it be subordinated to theocratic bourgeois nationalism of any kind. And this means we do need to delineate from the politics and the strategy of even some of the more respected groups, which do include Hamas, which do include the Houthi rebels and their program, which does not see liberation as something that workers fight for, and does not see liberation in the form of a socialist Palestine or a socialist Middle East. Yes, we support military resistance, all military resistance, which leads to freedom for Palestine, which leads to a weakening of Israel and the US. But we can have no illusions that the military actions of the axis of resistance come with a strategy that aims to truly liberate Palestine. So in this regard, at Left Voice, we put forward, in order to not just criticize, but to present an alternative based on revolutionary socialist politics. We put forward the demand for one single secular Palestinian socialist Palestinian state within the framework from the river to the sea. That part's important. Within the framework of a federation of socialist states in the Middle East and North Africa. And we see this as only possible by uniting the unity of the workers of the Middle East, along with workers around the world, and especially here in imperialist countries. And because the Palestinian cause acts as an expression of the open wound that workers of the Middle East have faced under the boots of imperialism and colonialism. We already see the way in which this struggle is uniting workers across borders and really putting them in confrontation with their own regimes. And in those confrontations, we have to side not with the regimes, but with the workers who are putting forward their own policy for the region, their own unity across borders, across divisions. Lastly, I think we should support through supporting workers' hegemony and a workers' politics throughout the Middle East, we should fight for it without capitulating at all to Zionism. We should still fight for sectors of the Jewish working class and the Israeli working class to break from Zionism. Yes, there are limits to this possibility, given the really reactionary character of the Israeli state and the limits it's placed on class solidarity. But the fact is that a socialist Middle East actually presents a vision for safety, security, and prosperity that Israel is incapable of delivering. And in this regard, through the development of a socialist politics, which sees the necessity of uniting the diversity of the region, Muslims, Jews, Christians, Palestinians, Arabs, we have to support this and anyone who breaks with Zionism towards this specific vision of a liberated Middle East and Palestine. And my last point I was going to say is that this vision has the opportunity to show workers around the world, not just the Middle East, but around the world, that we don't need oppression. We don't need exploitation. We don't need wars, hateful ideologies like Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, the real version of it, misogyny, queerphobia, and certainly U.S. imperialism. Iran and the axis of resistance will never fight for such a system, but our movement can and it must.